All right. So our last little lecture on presidents, we're going to talk about the empirical presidency and what that is and how Congress tried to bring the power of the president in after we talked about how the president started to gain power, get more control of power. And a lot of it, again, has to do with, the situation, the time after World War II, during World War II, the Great Depression, Corona for your guys' time, 9/11. When these national and natural disasters happen, typically we look to the president, so the president is going to get more power. I don't, again, just updating you on stuff I've been paying attention to. Just fascinating that the president hasn't put a shelter in place for the federal government because he doesn't want to step on certain governors' toes. But it goes back to the culture war thing. Certain red states have been really reluctant to put the shelter in place, like the blue states did pretty quickly. We're a blue state. We did it quickly. Florida just did it today, but they didn't cancel church services. They asked President Trump in his news conference yesterday, what about that? And he didn't really answer the question. He didn't want to. And so, again, he just didn't really want to step on toes and dictate what to do. That's the beauty of federalism. Again, we have the separation of powers in the 10th Amendment. I keep hammering this home because they keep talking about it. All righty, so let's talk about empirical presidency before I get ahead of myself. Oh, don't forget the quiz. You got the quiz. I just posted it. 32 questions of fun. Try to get it done by tomorrow at midnight. For most of you, that's probably just your lunch time because you wake up at probably 2 or 3. And then, but if you can watch that, get the quiz done so I can put some more grades in the grade book. The empirical presidency is based upon a novel written by Arthur Schlesinger. And he was basically suggesting that the president had grown in excess and too much power. A response to that, why this has happened, was written by Theodore Lowe. None of that's really important. But here's what is important. These are the areas of abuse by Schlesinger. So why you get this term, the empirical presidency. War powers. In the Constitution, Congress declares war. However, we've gone to war without having Congress declare war since World War II. So that's the first thing here. The president he's power commander in chief, but Congress wanted to declare war. Well, what are we going to do? Again, it has to go back to Congress has the power of the purse. The president has the power of the sword. The sword being the pen, the sword being force. Force is the military. And so this just talks about how we've gone to war without a declaration of war more than 125 times. Since Vietnam, we've had the Forgotten War, the Korean War. I could say, I can't remember the name of it, but that joke is kind of old. You'd laugh if you're in class. Third period gets it, even though I have a third period now, but I won't much longer. But third period would get it. They'd get the joke. Remember, I don't have a third. Anyway, but just understand we've got Korea. We've had Vietnam. We've had both Iraqi wars. We're in war now. We've never declared war. And because, again, if you declare war, who gets special powers? Congress, the president does. Sorry. If Congress declares war, the president gets special powers. So who's afraid of doing that? Congress is. And so just important to note and understand. And so, again, this just talks about some of those reasons. And it says one of the reasons why is because emergency powers go to the president. Some emergency powers, in times of emergency, the president gets much power. Again, the suspension of habeas corpus with Civil War with Lincoln, censorship of mail, both World War I and World War II, control of manufacturing, both World War I and World War II, control of communication and transport, think after 9/11, declaration of martial law, World War II. This is also World War II. Where I'm surprised. Think about now. We hasn't declared a shelter in place yet. He's let it up to the states. But if we had that, think about what coronavirus could lead to. And the Patriot Act, that was after 9/11. Remember, we talked about using of executive agreements rather for treaties, because having to get a treaty requires consent from Congress. Why would I want consent from Congress when I could just do an executive agreement and go around that? And so that's a pretty big thing. Also, you're fine. You're fine. You have also, with that, most presidents do this. Sorry, that was the custodian coming in my room. You have most presidents doing this. And so this is something that they're saying you're supposed to do checks and balances according to Congress, but they're using their own power. Executive privilege, not divulging the conversations like we've talked about. Yeah, the big one here is U.S. versus Nixon, when the Supreme Court actually ruled against him. It says you are actually entitled to executive privilege most of the time, but not when you've committed a crime. And so that's when presidents don't have this. But invoking executive privilege when you're protecting the people that are giving you advice rather than having them speak in front of Congress when they're doing an investigation or oversight, that's kind of an abuse of power, because they're trying to check to make sure you didn't do something wrong, but yet you're saying these people don't have to speak. Well, how are we going to check on you? So there's that. Impoundment. This is when the president refused to give money that's already been allocated, which means given to in the budget, and they refuse to spend the money that's appointed by Congress. Nixon did this when he did not impose. He imposed the money, a lot of money going to welfare, because it had already been appropriated by Congress, but he said, welfare is not a big deal. So there's that. So these are just some examples of how the president has abused power in war and during times of emergency: executive agreements, executive privilege, and not giving money that's supposed to be allocated to funds. So this is called impoundment. So Congress then is going to respond to the empirical presidency by passing certain legislation. The first one is the War Powers Act, or the War Powers Resolution 1973. And all this is a guideline of things that the president can do and must do, and then notify Congress. So you can't just send troops to war. You have to notify Congress, get permission. And so it says here, the president can send troops overseas in areas where hostilities are imminent without a congressional war declaration under these circumstances. You got to notify Congress. Must withdraw the troops in 60 days. One problem with this, and you can extend it, is if everybody knows we might have to withdraw our troops in 60 to 90 days, you would just wait and withdraw the troops. Sorry about that. You would withdraw the troops. And so they don't necessarily, that's not a good thing. Must consult with Congress before troops engage. Stop sending me emails. And Congress can pass a resolution not subject to president veto to withdraw troops. It's hard to do. This state's unconstitutional. You're taking away the president's authority as commander in chief. So that's some of the criticisms. Ties the hand of the president. It's not too flexible. It makes it easier for the enemy. The big thing here is this is a political hot potato, because it says right here, presidents claim this unconstitutional and disregard it. And they've never had a lawsuit to determine the constitutionality. Nobody sued and said, wait a minute, you can't do this. The attorney general, the one who's supposed to enforce the laws, isn't going to, because the president appoints him. Congress doesn't want to, because what happens if they said, okay, you must withdraw the troops, but public opinion is like, we need to be at war, then they got to declare war, and who gets special powers? The president. So every president seems to be in violation of the War Powers Act, but just understand this was passed in response to the president having too much power. And examples would be Vietnam and Korea. If you look at the date, Vietnam was still going on, but that's an example. The emergency powers, you had the passage of the National Emergencies Act, 1976. And it talks about how the president cannot have these powers for much longer than 6 months. And then if you want longer than that, Congress is going to review it. You have the passage of the CIA to deal with a lot of the wiretapping issues. And this is, Congress and not passage yet. Congress and the CIA deals with a lot of the abuses by Congress. So Congress must have to oversight the CIA to make sure that they're not abusing their powers, and that they can't just act as some rogue government agency like you see in the media or the news, not the media, but the news. And so you have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And this is basically to keep in check what they're, who they're bugging and who they're not. Confirmation of presidential appointees. You have this thing about senatorial courtesy. We'll talk about that, but that's more of a long established tradition that you must get in order to appoint a federal judge in a state. You must get consent from the two congressmen. If they say no, whether, any federal judge, it's going to be like, in our federal courts, if they both congressmen say no, then you can't, or one of the congressmen says no, you can't appoint that judge. And so there's some talks about some stuff here. Rule of fitness seems to be no longer efficient. Now nominees' preferences are fair game to scrutiny on as to like rather rule of fitness, can they do the job? Now it's like, well, what are their decisions? What's their ideology? Like a litmus test. So this is just talking about presidential appointees, whether it's in the judicial branch, which typically is more controversial than anything else, or not. Legislative veto. So this is important. Let me talk about this. In the past, Congress passes a law. They give it to the executive agency or the bureaucratic agency to enforce the law. So essentially, Congress passes a vague law. They give it to the bureaucratic agency, which understands like environmental protection. Give it to the EPA. They write all the standards to the new law. They interpret that vague law and they make policy out of it. They make things that we got to follow. Then Congress could then analyze those regulations or the policy of the regulations and veto them if it desired. So essentially, you're changing the law after it was passed because you didn't like how the EPA did this. So this was a way of forcing the bureaucracy to conform to congressional intent. And then you had INS versus Chadha that said the Supreme Court declared the legislative veto to be unconstitutional violation of separation of powers. But then you had another act, Congressional Review Act, allows Congress to repeal regulations with president approval. And it talked about what Clinton did with OSHA. And then this is one of the first times this act was used. But just understand that you can use it. It's not used much, but legislative veto, you can change. This is just an oversight by Congress to, again, go after the bureaucracy. And these are just some of the foreign affairs that we've had and what we've been involved in and how they've tested that of the War Powers Act. But again, how Congress is, try to rein in presidential power. I'll let you look at this. And then that'll be it when it comes to the presidential notes. We'll have a little bit of a review when we come back, but any questions, please feel free to email me. If I can stop this thing.